Okay, fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy week. Depending on whether you're in the Russian program or Indonesian program or one of the other programs, it's either week 6 or week 5 of CLI. So we're all kind of, just trusting life and moving along nicely and learning our various languages. And as part of our CLI programming this summer, we're happy to have speakers from our ASU community, from our scholarly communities. And this talk, as I've said numerous times now, is one of the ones I've been most excited about, probably in part because Dr. Popova is a fellow anthropologist. She's an archaeologist, and she's an honors faculty fellow and principal lecturer at Barrett, the Honors College at ASU, where she's been since 2006. And she specializes in the archaeology and paleoecology of Eurasia. Her work focuses on the way in which pastoral communities shape the history of the Silk Road, and currently she's an area coordinator for the LandUse6k Project, the goal of which is to make a digital integrative map of land cover change in the world that is linked to detail archaeological and historical data. So we welcome Dr. Popova here today for her talk entitled Examining the Silk Road Roots of Tea Time Through Archaeology. And I will hand it over to her now to take it away, to take us on this very exciting journey.
All right, so I'm just going to preface my talk with some assumptions I made about the audience, because you never know. You never know. So my assumption is that the people here don't necessarily know a whole lot about Silk Road history and don't necessarily know some of the basics about sort of like the historical dynamics between, say, nomadic groups in the steppes and the Chinese Empire or things like that. So for some of you, this might be your specialty and you'll be like, oh, so simplistic. And some of you might be like, what is she even talking about? I'm trying to get that middle road between complicated and taking it seriously while at the same time not alienating anybody from it. And I feel like I have a unique perspective when we look at the Silk Road because my interest is sort of Central Asia. I work in Russia doing my archaeological projects, but they're just north of Kazakhstan, right? So really, if we think historically, like Bronze Age, which is my time period, 2000 BCE, Kazakhstan and Russia are not two separate places, right? I can walk across the border of Russia into Kazakhstan, and I have. It's not difficult to do. It's the same land, right? So I'm thinking about broadly how people in the center impacted everybody around them. But if you read lots of texts about the Silk Road, it's usually the other way around. They'll start with Persia or they'll start with China and they'll talk about how those empires impacted the lives of people in Central Asia. So I'm always trying to think about, well, how can I recenter it and sort of place it interestingly on the people who are living in Central Asia and show how they were important for these global shifts, especially in botanical items, which is my specialty. So I thought for today, the talk would be nice to have like a tea, a Central Asian tea set out for us. So when I do excavations there, when we break for tea in the afternoon, when it's like 100 degrees, because it gets pretty hot there, we'll have nuts and we'll have dried fruits and we'll have tea as much as you want to drink. And then of course, if we can get it, there's always some sort of melons and usually watermelons. And so this is sort of like the way that you relax when it's so hot and it's so terrible. And when I did a study abroad trip in China, when you got overheated, they said, oh, you need to eat watermelon, it'll help cool you down. So there are these sort of trends and ideas that are connected to tea and watermelon that really unite this area of the world in interesting ways. My assumption, though, is that actually people don't really know how tea came to be so central to all of that area of the world, and how watermelon also came to be tied to tea and also connect to those worlds. They have very different kinds of stories, so they're kind of cool to connect. So I'm going to take a little moment to pull up my PowerPoint, and I hope you don't all fall asleep because PowerPoint and Zoom, it's rough, man. So I hope that I can keep you interested. The first thing that popped up is, of course, this is like, for me, as somebody who studied Russian and works in Russia, like the quintessential sort of like depiction of tea time. And you've got the watermelon and you have the merchant's wife with her tea and her tea bowl, and she's got her cat. I mean, I imagine it actually is criticism of the bourgeois lifestyle of the merchants, but it shows this idea of like how tea and abundance is an important part of hospitality. I want to move it to the next slide. I got my, there we go. All right, so one of the things I'm interested about with tea and watermelon, and this comes from my anthropological standpoint, is both how they get integrated into sort of the mundane aspects of life. So now, if we go to many of the places in Central Asia or Russia, tea is just a very ordinary, sometimes part of life. That doesn't mean it isn't important, it's just so interwoven. We might say the same thing with like watermelon being associated with summertime, but it wasn't always that way, right? And so this talk is about sort of like taking it apart a little bit from what we've seen as being so common and ordinary and seeing how it got to be that way in the first place. And then of course, if we go farther back in the past, we can see that these items can have important religious significance, or they can have important ceremonial importance. And then actually both watermelon and tea are quite politically and culturally politically important in this area. So we're going to look at how they're political items that help shape the region. So before I delve into all this, though, there's a couple things I need to set straight about Silk Roads that usually surprise my students. So one is that there isn't just one road. We call it the Silk Road. It's a misnomer, right? Of course, it's Silk Roads. It's many, many roads. Some of them are important in certain time periods. They become less important in later time periods. And of course, there's a whole maritime aspect to the Silk Roads. It's really about this very early global networks of exchange that we're interested in exploring. The other one is that, of course, most of the objects that are traded along the Silk Roads are actually local products, right? So they're not traveling these tremendous distances. They certainly can. And archaeologically, we always get really excited when we find, say, something from China, like all the way in Rome. We're like, whoa, how'd that happen? And we want to figure out how it got all the way there. And the legacies and the histories of those items can be really exciting. But for the most part, everything is being traded probably fairly short distances. And so when things are not traded in short distances, when they do travel longer distances, tea would be one of those things. And interestingly enough, sometimes watermelon, then they become sort of important commodities that are connected in maybe deeper ways than just some of the other things like dried fruits and nuts that might be traded along the Silk Road. The last thing is, of course, is not primarily about silk. Silk was an important commodity along the Silk Road. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it that. And one of the reasons why it's pretty important is we see that, like in the Tang Dynasty, soldiers that are on the outposts in the deserts, like the Taklamakan Desert, would be paid in bolts of silk. That's because other ways to pay them were kind of difficult. So they might have like shortages in metals, right? So difficulty in minting new coins, but you've got silk. Other things is if you wanted to give them grains, but they're in places where the grains might spoil before they get there, it sort of hurts your ability to pay for your troops that are in what was at that point quite distant outposts. So silk is important, often in ways people don't realize. I have other talks that I do where I talk about how silk is traded in different types of textiles, but that isn't the focus for today. So that's one of the reasons why we're going to look at some other important objects or items that were traded along the Silk Road that are not maybe what people traditionally imagine. And then I put this up just because I think it's really cool. It just recently popped up on social media, but it isn't necessarily a new idea. But this gives you a sense of the sort of divided nature of the land routes on the Silk Roads versus the maritime Silk Road routes, right? And so it's about the naming of tea. How do people call it chai or shai or cha in a lot of parts of the world, but it's tea, right? In say like Italy and France and England and the United States. And that comes down to sort of where they were getting their tea from. So if it was where we see like Taiwan and Fujian province, we would see that they speak a Minnan form of Chinese. And then that form, it's pronounced like te. I don't speak any Chinese. So if you do, just work with me. But in Mandarin, it's more like cha. And so when it gets traded along the land routes, people know it by that term and use that term in order to sort of refer to the beverage. Interestingly enough, there are some places you can see other regions that have gray, and they didn't use either. They have completely different terms for tea, and that's usually because they already had some form of tea growing there that they've recognized as a beverage. And when tea, as we know it, gets introduced there, they see it as the same thing. So they use the same term and they feel no need to take the foreign term to describe it. All right, so let's move on to tea in more detail. So you probably all know, and maybe you are one of those people, that tea is one of the most popular non-alcoholic beverages consumed by over 2/3 of the world's population. And that's, you know, for its caffeinated nature. It's got a wonderful taste, aroma. Lots of people believe that it has medical properties. We're reading stuff in the news all the time about green tea might improve your longevity and those sorts of things. And that's really nothing new in the discussion about tea. What people don't know, though, is that the legacy of tea and how tea was spread throughout Eurasia is actually a fairly complicated story. And one that we don't fully understand, because as we try to go farther and farther back in that history, there's less that we know. One of the earliest historical sources is actually the contract for youth, or sometimes the slaves, it's called the slaves contract, written by Wang Po. And it's supposed to be a sort of like a joke, like all these funny things I will make my poor slave do or servant do. And then in one of those things, he says that he will demand that the servant go buy him tea in Wuyang. Now, there's some scholars that say that no, this isn't what he's talking about. It's probably a corruption. He's talking about something else. Other scholars believe that there's plenty of evidence to suggest they were already drinking tea in Wuyang at that time. In any case, we're talking about 59 BCE, so that's fairly early. Then we have, but through the Three Kingdoms period, the Jin dynasties, the southern and northern dynasties, so about 220 to 589 CE, we already have quite a lot of texts. Ooh. Okay, quite a lot of texts that actually talk about tea, well, primarily in terms of its meditative benefits and also as its medical benefits. One of the ones that I really like is around 290 CE, there was a text called The History of the Three Kingdoms. And in it, the historian talked about how the last Wu emperor, Sun Hao, really liked to drink alcohol. Like, he just had these huge raging parties all the time. And he wanted to party with his court historian named Wei Zhao, but he was actually a total lightweight. And he was always falling asleep because just too much alcohol for him, and he'd just take a nap. So the emperor would sneak him tea and give him tea sometimes instead of alcohol to try and wake him up again. So we start seeing little references to tea pop up in the historical texts that show that over time it becomes more important and integrated into Chinese society. There wasn't a really deep appreciation for tea, at least this is what they thought, until these sort of later time periods, sort of 500, 600 CE. That was the prevailing sort of view. And interestingly enough, you might imagine that this was like shared with people around them, but the nomadic groups to the north, especially in the 5th and 6th century BC, actually saw the beverage tea as a way of dividing themselves from the Chinese. So they would say that that was a disgusting drink, you know, something only sedentary people would drink, and that they preferred their kumis, right? So early on in the story of the stories about tea, we see that actually a lot of people thought of them as more a way of dividing their cultural identities. But then we have the archaeology, which just throws everything that we thought we knew about tea a little bit into an upheaval. So previously, the oldest archaeological evidence for tea was from China's Northern Song Dynasty, which is 960 to 1127 CE. That's pretty recent from an archaeological standpoint. But we kind of knew that tea, silk, porcelain were all being traded from Chang'an, the capital of the Chinese Empire. And so if these things were being traded, why couldn't we find evidence of tea? Of course, tea doesn't preserve really well, especially if we're thinking about trying to preserve leaves, right? So we were really trying to look for literally a needle in a haystack. Where can we find a place where tea is preserved, where it was actually traded? But luckily, we actually found some evidence of this. Two archaeological sites have changed our interpretation of this. One is, I hope you can see the map there. One is that there was a burial site of the Han Dynasty Emperor Jingdi. He was buried in 141 BCE, so very early, right? And the second is an elite burial from the 2nd to 3rd century CE found in Tibet in the Nagari district. The pictures that you see there, the big pit, those are both of the Han Dynasty tomb. But the two samples that you see there of the botanical material are actually of the tea remains that they found. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these two sites. So the tomb of the Emperor Jingdi, which is, I don't know why it's not more famous. It's actually really cool. It has a lot of the things that we might expect from an emperor of the Han Dynasty. So it has, like you might know about the terracotta warriors. This is sort of a precursor to that. We have all these sort of clay figurines standing in guard, sort of servants, maybe warriors standing in guard of the emperor. We have ceramic vessels filled with all kinds of different types of items. They have millet, chenopodium. We have rice in these objects. There's horses and chariots, live horses, unfortunately, and chariots buried in there, as well as really cool, you can see in the back on the right, figurines, lots and lots of figurines of animals. So there's animals all over there. So one of the things we know about Jingdi was that he was actually a very devout Taoist. And so this is, although he's surrounded by lots of other Han emperors, he's the only one to date that they found that had lots and lots of tea buried with him. And we can perhaps imagine that this served some sort of religious purpose for him. But in any case, he stands out as being unique in that way. And because there's such good preservation at this site, because it's quite arid there, the actual tea buds survived. And so it's not even just tea leaves, it is literally the best part of the tea, the very top, the very first harvest of the tea that he would have had. And all of these items were put in the tomb in order for this person to be able to have them later on in the afterlife. So he wants to make sure he's got all his favorite things. The cemetery in Nagari is really interesting too. Again, it's of an elite person, but here we see, and it's a little bit later, but we see the evidence of the connection with China that we were wanting to see before, right? So first you see a silk tapestry, and it has some symbolism in it that is connected to the aristocracy back in China. We have these ceramic bowls, we have a gold foil mask, there's clay discs, all kinds of interesting, obviously elite items that are put in this tomb. And in that time, it would have been it would have been in the capital of, I'm forgetting the name now. I think it's the Zhang dynasty in Tibet. So most students don't know that Tibet had quite an impressive empire that was constantly sort of waging war and causing problems for the Chinese empire. And so this was one of their dynastic rulers. But what we can see is that there was a very close connection between Tibet and China at this time, probably through gift exchange of prestige items, and most importantly, tea. So one of the things that paleobotanists do is they can look at phytoliths, which are the silica that is left behind in plant materials, and they can compare them with known plant materials that we have now, just to verify that they're the same thing. So if you look at the weird little shapes on the top of that slide, those are all from the archaeological materials. And then on the bottom, they're being compared to tea that's from modern examples. And so what you can see is that they're actually the same thing. So even though it looked like it and the archaeologists assumed that it probably was the same thing, this sort of confirmed it for them. So this makes it the earliest known archaeological evidence of tea in the world, which not relying on text, but on actual physical evidence. So that sets the story way farther back than most historians were willing to consider. It pushes it all the way back 2,000 years ago, if we're thinking about Jingdi's tomb. So another thing that we should consider, and you probably, if you do know about the history of tea, you've probably read it in these terms, which is that it has a lot to do with especially the spread of Buddhism. So tea becomes an important way of sort of staying awake. It's a replacement for alcohol. It's a meditative aid. And so we have a lot of stories that are connected to it about the creation of tea connected to sort of important Buddhist figures. So in one case, we have Bodhidharma fell asleep, and then his eyebrows fell off, and then he took the eyebrows and made tea, and then he used it to drink and stay awake. In Japan, they got a way more gory, hardcore one, which is that a Buddhist monk cuts off his eyelids. They dry, he puts them into water and drinks them as a way of staying awake. Also, you can't close your eyes anymore. So either way it works, whether it's a tea or it's his eyeballs, or his eyelids. So both of them, though, are stories that very explicitly connect sort of the development of tea as a drink with Buddhism itself. And so there's also some stories that are connected to sort of the political legacy of this. So the connection of tea with Buddhist faithful meant that at the end of Northern Wei dynasty, 2 million monks and nuns were consuming the beverage at about some 40,000 monasteries. So that's like by 434 CE, that's 2 million monks on the regular as part of their diet drinking this beverage at 40,000 monasteries. And during the early Tang dynasty, so a little bit later, Buddhism and tea were transmitted together as a package to the nomadic tribes of the Tibetan Plateau, unified under Songsan Gampo in 605-50 CE. But the interesting thing here is then tea and Buddhism become sort of like a way of China showing that they believe that they're superior. So the story that comes out there is that tea comes to Tibet by a Chinese princess who marries the emperor there and brings both Buddhism and tea to Tibet, which of course is ridiculous because now from the archaeological evidence, we know that it was there several centuries before. So when we hear these stories, we see that they're sort of connected to these concepts of sort of like political control and sort of like, I guess, wanting to create a sense that you're the creators or the source of these important things like the connection of tea to Buddhism. Tea is also really importantly connected to warfare. So over time, tea, like gold and silver, became a strategic bargaining piece for the Chinese government in an effort to control nomadic confederacies at their northern and northwestern borders, like the Shanyu, the Hanbei, and the Uyghurs. So as soon as you get those nomadic groups to like tea, well, then you can say, okay, well, we will give you tea unless you give us something that we want. And most of the time, it was actually their horses. Right, so after suffering numerous defeats at the hands of their nomadic neighbors, the Song government, that's 960, about 1279 CE, established the Tea and Horse Agency with the purpose of purchasing strong Tibetan horses to help them combat the very people they were getting horses from. Not surprisingly, I mean, and they took 520 pounds of tea up to the northern depots to sort of make sure that this trade happened, but they weren't really knowledgeable about what made a good horse. And so they were often given the worst of the lot. So the northern neighbors would keep the best horses and they would give the Chinese empire all of their sickly old and animals they didn't necessarily want. And of course, keep the tea. You could say you don't want to do that anymore, but then of course, then you're probably going to unleash warfare on you because they did the trade, right? And although tea was everywhere around them, interestingly enough, the Mongols became tea drinkers quite late. Tea was not listed by William of Rubric, who visited the Mongol capital of Karakum for several weeks in 1254, but he only mentions kumis, probably mead, rice beer, and then purified horse milk. And there are probably several reasons why they didn't at least originally embrace tea. One was that they really liked kumis and they thought it was superior. That seems to be a common thread in the northern neighbors kind of argument for what is the perfect beverage. The other thing is that they had a lot of other beverages that they already drank that were like tea, right? So do you need specifically what we consider tea now, or can they drink the other like 50 different types of plants that they consume as tea? And the last one is that it connected them, it united them with sort of that Chinese identity. But once the Mongols actually become the rulers of China, and now they have access to all of that wonderful, the wonderful imperial tea groves and all the best tea in the world. And not surprisingly, they sort of decide they like tea. And so still, but it's not just about drinking the tea. They also like the idea that like you can tax tea. Everybody's now addicted around you to tea. Everybody wants tea. So how wonderful is it that not only do we get to drink this, but we can tax everybody who wants it. And the Mongols did some interesting things too with making Russians feel terrible about not having tea and blocking their access to tea and things like that. Even when they do adopt tea, and this is something that I wish I could explore more, but we don't have as much time as I would like. They have a different way of consuming it, right? So you probably know about milk tea, but even from the very beginning, the preference was to have it with butter and curds, sometimes add in some grains, which I mean would have absolutely made sort of the emperors like lose their mind, right? Although in lots of places in the world, when tea is first introduced, it is often sort of this drink that has a bunch of different components or spices or things like that in it. So by the 16th century, direct trade was opened up with Mongolia with 6 trading stations along the Great Wall. And the Chinese regularly traded tea for Mongolian horses, which they now needed to fight the Manchus, right? So there's always a constant need for horses. I guess the horses died a lot. From Kalgan, the tea was transported in brick form by long camel caravans to the Mongol capital. By the 18th and 19th century, Mongolia was inundated by tea bricks, which you can see over on the left top. Which they started using as currency, which when you think about it, it works really great as currency. It's pretty durable. You can break it up into pieces so you see how it's been scored, and you can divide it up to however much you need to use it. It also made it possible for Mongolians to love tea even more. So clearly this worked. They had so much tea, they didn't know what to do with it. And so of course, when you have that much tea, you're gonna drink it. If we look at Mongolia today, they consume an average of 18 pounds of tea per person each year. That's a healthy tea diet right there. And when you think about it, they have 22 different plants that they also use as tea and will use as tea substitute if they don't have tea, but they still are one of the few places that prefer tea in this brick tea form. And also partially because of the way they prepare it, boiling it and making it into that sort of milky, savory, salty kind of beverage instead of what most people in other places in the world do. All right, well, we can't just stay on tea for forever. So it's time to switch over to melons. So whereas tea was a staple early on in the Silk Road trade, watermelon was not. Melons were pretty common, especially in Central Asia, but that doesn't mean they were necessarily traded or certainly not cultivated in, say, China very early on. But I want to focus particularly on watermelon because watermelon is a very unique type of plant and isn't connected to the types of melons that are traditionally from Central Asia. But archaeologists in general tend to talk about, when they talk about melons, they're talking about your good old cucurbits instead, right? So one of the reasons why is that if I talk about more types of plants, it's the whole family, I can talk about the diversity of types of plants I see in different places. So I can talk about how China has bitter melon and wax gourds and snake gourds. And I can talk about how muskmelons or winter melons were common in Central Asia. It's also really hard to identify the seeds if we do get them. So if I get a seed, I'm not necessarily sure which seed it is. There are so many varieties, and some of the varieties that were grown in Central Asia don't grow anymore. There's actually the genetic diversity of melons being currently grown in Central Asia have been decreasing year after year, right? So I don't have a good comparative collection to know, like this is definitively this kind of melon. And then of course, they don't preserve really well. Watermelon seeds are actually pretty robust, but most melon seeds are not. And so unless they were sort of charred or in a very arid environment, I wouldn't be able to find them, right? So talking about melons is actually rather challenging from an archaeobotanical standpoint, but still it's worth it because the story of watermelons is really cool. So I would say like there are melons that would grow in China. So the bitter melon, wax gourd, snake gourd, those are all very old and were cultivated for a long time in China. And we do know this, except nobody wanted them, right? So if we want to look at the spread of these melons, they didn't spread very easily. So people had a hard time knowing what to do with them, didn't necessarily incorporate them into their cuisine. There's the same thing, I think they're called snap melons in India, right? They're these kind that kind of burst when they get ripe. They're kind of hard to trade because they burst when they're ripe, right? But also, again, difficult to sort of explain why you like these things that seem like they're like maybe potentially dangerous and hazardous, right? So certain things will will make it more likely for people to want to have these melons versus others. Cantaloupe, muskmelon, well, especially winter melon, those sorts of things do become spread across Central Asia, but there's always a special sort of love for watermelons. So there's less historical evidence about watermelons than there is about tea, but that's because it hasn't been in the region for as long. And like I said, there's also real issues with sort of the way archaeological research is done and whether or not they're even collecting archaeobotanical data. And even if they are, then did those seeds preserve? But there just was a story that came out that had a really interesting story, that they finally determined that the Kordofan melon in Sudan is the precursor of all of our modern day watermelons through DNA analysis, which is very exciting. And that helps us sort of paint the story of watermelon in the old world, because we kind of already knew that there were melons, probably watermelons, already back in ancient Egypt, right? So if you see this cool little picture, I don't know how they know that's a watermelon, quite frankly. It looks like a ham bone in Jello or something, but I don't know. They say that that's a watermelon. I believe them. In King Tut's tomb, they actually found, I know, doesn't it look like, I don't know. Well, they're like, it's a striped melon, obviously. They found seeds of watermelon in King Tutankhamun's tomb. So we knew that watermelons were already growing in this region. And so the question is then, how do they get from Africa into sort of Central Asia and into Asia? Records of cultivated watermelons are known from Israel, from South Arabia, and Greece by the first millennium BCE. So they're around there, but they were not introduced into Eurasia until later, although the Central Asian oasis states became leading producers. So once there was a realization that people wanted these things, and once there were travelers who were moving along with them, there was a lot of interest in being able to grow them. They weren't known in China until about 1000 CE, but that was because their neighbors, their nomadic neighbors, were either connected to people who were cultivating them or cultivating themselves. The great thing about watermelon is it actually, especially its early precursors, are very drought resistant, or very good at sort of just growing on their own. So you don't actually have to spend that much time to cultivate them. And this is one of the things that's coming out in our archaeological research about pastoralists in Central Asia, is that doesn't mean that they don't cultivate things. It doesn't mean that they don't have agriculture. It just doesn't look anything like sedentary agriculture. And so I think as we start to understand that better, we'll be able to find some of these resources as well. So if we look at, there we go. There has recently been an excavation in the Pamir Mountains of Eastern Uzbekistan at a site called Tashbaluk. And the interesting thing about this is a pretty high elevation site. So it's 2,100 meters above sea level. Certainly you're not growing watermelons there, but the paleobotanists who worked there found evidence of grains, legumes, fruits, and nuts, all of which indicated that they were trading, and melons, trading with people who lived in more and lower elevations where these things would grow. And so this comes from, I don't know what time period. I think it's Iron Age. So I'm going to say it's around 100 CE. So we know that then these melons, these grapes, these nuts, these dried fruits, and all these things are already pretty commonly traded throughout Central Asia. The question is then, how do we get them into sort of other areas like Asia, like into China? Historical sources attest to the importance of fresh and dried fruits and nuts as a source of commerce at the market bazaars across Inner Asia, and is an important element for a proper sort of like hospitable tea ceremony. If you're going to have people over, this is part of what you try to give them. These trade routes facilitated the spread of many of our most familiar crops across the ancient world. So there's clear evidence for peaches and apricots from Eastern China, but they were present in the Mediterranean by the classical period. Likewise, grapes originated somewhere in the broader Mediterranean region, but grape wine was popular drink in China by the Tang Dynasty. So although we can't see exactly how over time they get from one place to the other, we can see sort of where they start being developed, and we can see when they get to another part of the Silk Road. We can now say that all these fruit crops were pretty prominent in Central Asia by about 1,000 years ago. So, and likely earlier than that, which means that what needed to happen was sort of the solidification or the intensification of these trade networks for these items to start making it further along the Silk Road. But they were critically important earlier in Central Asia. Okay, so when people started cultivating watermelons in Eurasia, they became pretty hard to ignore. Even if you have all other kinds of melons growing around, they're really beautiful with the striking green, with the yellow stripes and then the really red fleshy interior. A lot of the other sorts of winter melons are actually, they don't have quite as interesting a flesh. And at least if we listen to some of the historical sources, they're not as tasty, right? So one of the first ones is in the account of the journey to the West in 1219 to 1224 CE. Yulu Chu Tsai wrote, in Bapu are large watermelons weighing 50 pounds each. A long-eared donkey can only carry 2 of them at the same time. And when he reaches Samarkand, he explains that all the watermelons are as big as the head of a horse. And then Ibn Battuta says that the watermelons of Khwarezm, or modern day Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, were the finest that he had ever tasted. Now, some try to argue, I've read some interesting accounts that like, nope, they were definitely not watermelons. They were something else. But he makes it pretty clear in his description that they're green with yellow stripes and they have bright red interiors. So if he isn't talking about watermelons, and I haven't found a good Central Asian variant that isn't a watermelon that has convinced me as of yet. So then it's possible to see how watermelons fit into the conceptions of hospitality and gift giving around 1200 CE in Eurasia. If we look at Cheng Chun, Taoist Monk's Travels, he's actually looking for Genghis Khan. They say he's in Central Asia, right? Find him, which I think is actually a fairly challenging task. But he decides he's going to do this. He's ordered by Genghis Khan to travel to his court, which is somewhere in Central Asia. So he's accompanied by his disciple, Li Qicheng, who composed the narrative and is sort of like a travel diary. So on one occasion, they visit friends who celebrate their arrival by having heavy watermelons and other sweet watermelons for them to relax and enjoy their time there. And while he's relaxing in Samarkand, because come on, it's a long journey, Cheng Chun was presented with watermelons as a gift by those who were cultivating them. And he was really excited. And he was like, oh, this is like such a great gift. And then they was told that he was supposed to make them as a present to a prince on along his way. So he wasn't allowed to keep the watermelon. Made him a little sad. And then when Cheng Chun finally meets up with Genghis Khan and they travel back up north together, the emperor sends him watermelons as a way of showing his thanks for what he's done and how he's actually helped the emperor. So we can see that Genghis Khan is showing his respect for the Taoist monk by giving him this watermelon, which was considered to be sort of like princely gift. It's possible to see the way in which watermelon cultivation was incorporated into nomadic pastoralist society, thanks to Ruy González de Clavijo, who died in 1412. He was sent as an ambassador to Tamerlane by King Henry III of Castile of Leon in Spain. And Clavijo's 4-year journey took him through Constantinople and then inland across Iran and into Central Asia, where he was received by Tamerlane in Samarkand. And while living with the nomadic Chagatais by the Tajan River in Central Asia, Clavijo noted that they passed to the plains besides the river in the summer, where they sow crops of corn, cotton, and tend to melon beds. Right. So here he's describing these people that are moving from camp to camp, but yet along the camp are visiting these places where they're actually growing some of these resources, including melons. Now, beyond signs of hospitality and respect, watermelons were revered because they were easily preserved and they could be traded long distances. So Ibn Battuta talks about how they were dried and that this was a good substitute if you couldn't give a free, like a fresh watermelon to someone. Clavijo describes the same thing in Samarkand, but the best gift would have been a fresh watermelon. There's some evidence that, like in China, they believe that maybe dried watermelon could help eye ailments. There are early sort of references to that. But so if we wanted to send somebody a really amazing gift, we know from some historical resources that actually whole watermelons were sent incredible distances by putting them in lead boxes packed with ice and then presented to somebody as a royal gift. And this happened a couple times. to emperors in China. So we can see it as a highly elevated, like very prestigious gift when it's both travels a great distance and arrives as a fresh thing. Now, one of my favorite things too is this cookbook. This is a cookbook written in 900 CE in Arabic. And it's by a cook in Baghdad. And he's talking about how to basically use watermelon in your cooking. And so one of the recipes that he's talking about here is he's like, well, you can get them from Maru in Persia, or you can get them from Khwarezm in Central Asia. He prefers the ones from Central Asia. And he says, if you manage to get one of those, and he did, again, packed in one of those lead cases, you could make it for a dish fit for a king. And his recommendation is to transform them into watermelon pudding that you then would put underneath a roast, and it would soak up all the yummy, yummy juiciness of the roast. And then you'd have like savory watermelon pudding. I'm not sure it's good. I don't know. I haven't ever tried it. I'm a vegetarian, so it makes it hard for me to try these exotic dishes. So in conclusion, I hope you enjoyed learning about these commodities and how they functioned on the Silk Road. I hope it helps you think about this network in a new way, and specifically how the pastoral nomadic neighbors interacted with the more sedentary empires around them. How you can think even, continue thinking about how tea became an important construct for social identity in these different places, how different places drink tea in very specific ways and types of cups, certain types of tea, green versus black or brick tea, milk tea, and that how as we do more archaeological research, our understanding of like how deep this history goes and how long these connections are is probably only going to keep changing. Just like dried fruit, they not only sweetened life, but they also cured ailments, at least as long if we think about what the people themselves said. But also I think that they're one of the both of them are sort of representations of what sort of bring people joy along these areas of the world, right? So whereas we might look at like conflict and control, like with the case of the horses or things like that, tea and watermelon are more about sort of hospitality and respect. And that's one of the things I like to also represent when I talk about the Silk Road. Another thing that's interesting about it too is, of course, thinking about China as a producer, right? So China also produces a lot of the world's tea. It also consumes a lot of it. And it also is the world's leading producer, and I think might also be consumer of watermelons. So they produce 79.2 million tons of watermelon every year, and they make up about 68% of the global consumption of watermelons. So for something that was like this prestigious gift that traveled in a lead box with ice, from Central Asia to 79.2 million tons, that's impressive increase in production. And I'll leave you with this last image, which just tickles me, which is in Tajikistan, they just built a giant watermelon tea house, right? So if you didn't think these things are connected, boom, there you go. If you ever go there, you can visit it. It holds over 2,000 people, and you can have tea service in the watermelon tea house. And that's my talk. Thank you so much for listening to me and being part of this presentation. And if anyone has questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Sorry, excuse me, I'm about to sneeze, so I shouldn't have unmuted, but we might pass. Okay, well, hopefully we have some questions from our audience. I'm happy to get the ball rolling because I have a kind of burning question, which is, I sort of put it in the chat as a joke, right? The Karakum Tea Party, but I was wondering if there's anything in the archaeological record that shows, when the thing is like when you get people or people hooked on something like tea, if you then decide to be like, to pull the rug out from under them and say, okay, no more tea for you unless you give us, taxes or horses or whatever, sometimes there's a revolt, right? So I was wondering if there's any kind of archaeological evidence for, a moments where there was a kind of tea-centered rebellion or the kind of conflict that was about, a refusal to deliver tea as expected.
They don't mention tea really specifically. They say like you didn't live up to the promises of the trade agreement, right? But when we start understanding that tea is a huge portion of the trade agreement, yeah, we could imagine that like if they're not getting as much tea as they expect, and especially if you have like institutions, like we look at the monasteries that have tea as a regimented aspect of the monks and the nuns' day, right? You get this much tea in a day, then we can understand why that would actually be pretty detrimental to like social control in those areas. And then there's also lots of stuff if you read the historical literature about like people being angry about how like tea is not strong enough, right? So clearly we can see people try to deal with this by making weaker tea, and they're not fooling anybody because lots of people like to complain in these documents about how the tea is crap. So when you see these travel documents, a lot of times they'll also talk about this had the worst tea ever or the weakest tea ever, or it was a good strong tea and I couldn't see the bottom of my cup and things like that.
Okay, thank you. And so I see we have a hand
Irina,
up. We have
can you hear me? Can you
yes,
hear
Emma?
Emma?
Yes, Emma. Yes.
I'm sorry. I never know if I can be heard or not. But I have to say that in Persia, chai khane is actually a stop instead of having a hotel all through the deserts, nomad areas. Not that there are that many in Rome, but there are, of course. When they say chai khane, chai, of course, chai, khane is home, and it means it's a place to welcome you. And there's always food, there's shelter for animals, and that has been for centuries. Just that word chai khane means that there's a stop to take a break. So chai khane has been in the Persian language, I don't know how many centuries, but that explains hotel. Instead of saying hotel, it's a chai khane, but very primitive, of course. And I don't know how far in history it goes, but it's very prevalent in the Persian vocabulary.
Mm-hmm. They're common all throughout Central Asia and along the Silk Road's path. So you're exactly right. And the idea is that these caravanserai or the chaikhane, those places would be really important for known spots where you could stop and have a place to stay and to refresh yourself. So the difficult thing is that like, I would like to talk about like architecture that's related to tea. And I also really wanted to talk about like objects that are related to tea, because even just thinking about like the types of cups that people use and why, or how they serve it or prepare it or what they put in it, that could be a whole separate talk. But clearly by the time that we really have like the Tang dynasty and beyond, that there are these established spots where people can stay and know that they're going to be able to get refreshment. And if you're going on an incredibly long journey, those are the safest places you could be. So I could see why they'd be important. And we can see that they're still important in the region today, right? So people still, that those tea houses still exist. There's still the concept that people want to go and socially relax with other people and have tea. So I think that those are connected to those early sort of spots.
So may I ask, actually Marco Polo was not discovering the route that was already open. He just opened it to Europe, and the actual route was from China all the way to Venice. Not 11th century, but even for much before BC, you said, which is amazing how far it was. Thank you for the information.
Julia, you had a question.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. It's interesting. I work on yerba mate, which is a caffeinated tea beverage in South America. So I really like the idea of studying historical objects and what they can tell us. But my question is kind of based off of my research. You mentioned how religion and also health benefits, when people were being introduced to tea, they talked about those factors had a lot of importance. I was wondering if the opposite was true at all, because what I find with yerba mate is there's all sorts of talk about it being a wonder drug, and because of the caffeine, it has a lot of positive health benefits. But then they also talk about the negatives of it, and that it's addictive, and the opposite sides of caffeine and this kind of addiction to a stimulant. And so I'm wondering if there was any talk about that or the negative aspects of tea.
There definitely was, especially in China in the Chinese historical sources, but they get drowned out by the meditative aid side. So I know there's one that just says like, it keeps you awake, and he doesn't mean it in a positive way. He's like, and then you can't sleep. So what good is that? Like, and he's trying to talk about how it's not as good as you think that it is. I can't remember the name of the scholar at the, but it was fairly early on, was trying to sort of disparage tea as not maybe as useful as people thought. But it becomes so incorporated, just mythological almost, especially with the development of Buddhism. And I think maybe, especially if we look at the Tomb of the Emperor, probably with Taoism too, really early forms of Taoism, it might have been important for that too. It's just not as studied, I don't think. Any other questions? Those two sites are so cool because it sets the narrative farther back, that China would always say that the love for tea and the development of tea as a drink was much, much older. And then you would have these cantankerous historians who would say, no, we don't have good, reliable historical evidence. So then to have the archaeological evidence pull it so much farther back actually allows for really interesting new ways of thinking about the history of tea in Asia in general. Yes, David?
What about they've talked about wine or beer or other ways of, it's a safe way of getting hydration. Is watermelon a good way? Does it filter out bad things and you end up, okay, I'm thirsty. You're saying it's a refreshing thing in the hot, dry summer, but also tea, you've boiled the water. And it was at some point in time, if you go back far enough, also a way of, hey, this is the best form of hydration we have. We have questions about the water.
I haven't heard about that with tea necessarily, because I mean, they already had other ways in which they were preparing stuff to stay hydrated. I think, but with watermelon, definitely. I mean, one of the reasons why we could see that pastoral nomads might want to also cultivate watermelon is, hey, that's a good way of staying hydrated if you're in very particularly arid environments. And then there's some funny things that Ibn Battuta says about like watermelon, like it's a really great thing to, like, if a kid has a fever, you put like a little watermelon helmet on his head. And then maybe it works. I don't know. It certainly would do something. So the travelers that are going along are just speculating what you could do with it, or maybe they saw somebody doing something with it and speculated about what that meant. But most of the time, I think it's just, I mean, especially with watermelon, it's just super delicious. They're always talking about how it's the most delicious thing they ever had, and beautiful. They'll compare it to like rubies, and they compare it to like, other beautiful things that they like. So I think that it was sort of seen almost like a very precious item.
Yeah.
May I just say that it's so interesting to hear what you're saying. But in Russia, from what I understand, my mother used to swear that watermelon, if you drink the juice of watermelon, it cleanses your kidneys. That it's the best cleanser, that everybody should have the juice or watermelon. It's the best thing for you. So
I heard the same thing from my mother-in-law. She said she'd buy these watermelons that would be horrible, and I wouldn't want to eat them at all. And she'd say, but they're good for your kidney. They'll clean out your kidney, so just eat it anyway.
That's right.
Yeah, I've heard that.
I don't know if it's a superstition or not, but there are so many stories about watermelon that is fascinating. And of course, tea. But thank you, wonderful story.
Well, if we look at the Kordofan melons in Sudan, they're not as tasty. They're a little bit bitter sometimes. Anyway, they're largely seen as just a way of actually staying hydrated, and that you drink them primarily to make yourself better. So if we go far enough back, we can see that when it's a lesser melon, and it's really, really water packed, but maybe not very delicious, they're like, just drink it anyway. So, and maybe Russians just always had bad watermelons at first. So they were just like, just drink it anyway.
Right.
Right. Well, thank you. Well, I also would love to talk about the different vessels. I know we're about to run out of time here, but when did we start having little delicate things to hold the cup so you wouldn't burn your hands, but also kind of what the kind of ideas about taste are in different vessels. So even I was amused to see a couple of years ago that Some of the most expensive glasses for drinking cognac or brandy were basically like what you would drink tea out of in Turkey or Azerbaijan, these like thin-waisted glasses, right? So were there ideas about taste in these vessels that sort of shape the kind of vessels you would drink tea out of? Or
Sure.
do they come, from they're just such a different, there's such a big variety of shapes for drinking tea out of. And I think that that's really interesting.
Yeah, I can say two examples really quick, which is in Uzbekistan, you have the little cups, right? Like bowls, the shallow bowls. And the idea behind that, it's actually quite smart, is that you hold it up at the top, right? And then you put the liquid in and the liquid doesn't burn your hands, right? But also you're not supposed to have that much liquid in it because you want the tea to be constantly hot for the person who's drinking it. So a shallow vessel actually makes sense to show generosity and hospitality, that if you really love your guests, you actually give them very little and you refill it quite a lot so that they always have constantly fresh tea. But interestingly enough, in Russia, which actually their development of like their tea culture is much later than a lot of other places in Central Asia, there's the idea that you drink out of the little glass cup with the metal holder. And the legend behind that is it was only supposed to be for men, and women would have ceramic teacups. And then they said the reason why was the glass vessels were so that you could look, and if you didn't see Konderstadt at the bottom where these things were made, you would know that it was actually really weak tea. 3 o'clock, right. You would know that it was weak tea. And then I think to myself, when I heard this legend, I was like, well, why don't women need to know they have weak tea? But maybe the idea too is that men drink strong tea, maybe unadulterated without sugar. Women drink weak tea with sugar, those sorts of things. So there's gendered aspects to the way that tea is consumed as well.
Lots to think about, fascinating. So thank you so much to Dr. Popova for sharing some of these new discoveries with us, and for bringing the discoveries from ethnobotany to bear on the way we think about, again, these things that we consume. Well, hopefully you guys are having a lot of good watermelon this summer. I could use some more. As you said, Laura, you didn't think that this summer's crop was that successful. I had some good, like honeydew, but not honeydew, cantaloupe, but I haven't had any amazing watermelon except for in my salad.
Nope.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for coming to the talk.
Thank you, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Okay. Bye-bye. Thanks.